In this module, I'm going to be discussing the emotion of sadness. Sadness is one of the most powerful and compelling emotions. It's not only one of the biggest reasons why many musicians express themselves, but it's also something that music really does for our world. It provides a form of catharsis. So understanding sadness is an extremely important idea. It's also probably the trickiest emotion to capture, especially when it comes to the mix side of things, because anytime we start doing heavy-handed processing, it's very, very easy to start creating a sense of something being processed, which creates a sense of something being artificial. So with all that said, I'm going to play a little bit of this record.
Could it be you instead of me to finally be free? Could it be you instead of me to finally be free?
So this is not like despair. This is not a wretched sadness. This is a wistful sadness. It's like a bittersweet, a sense of longing for something or wishing something had been different, but knowing that it can't. Now the question is, how do we start encapsulating these ideas? Now that we know that we're going for a sweeter sadness, now that we know that it's important to listen to the pocket of the guitar and, that the strings are going to give us our big ending, what can we focus on in order to get that? So I went back and forth a few times over a few different ideas, and here's ultimately what I came up with. Because the sound of the strings is very virtual, a lot of my voicing and getting things right required me getting the strings correct first, which is a little counterintuitive. And this is actually something that I learned while I was making this tutorial, because I started many times from trying to choose the right guitar, and I kept hitting brick walls. Once I started from the strings, everything started to make sense. So I'm going to start with the strings, but the ideas for the strings and the ideas for the guitars are almost completely separate ideas at first, that then come together later. All right, so just going into the strings here, let's mute up our guitars and our vocals and play the strings out from the very back chorus. So to my ear, the things that give away that these are not real strings is that sort of plasticky sensibility that's happening in the violin in particular, and the viola to an extent as well. And then just also sort of a little too much perfection when it comes to how everything's coming together, because there's so much microtonal variation on strings. Typically speaking, if we don't hear that, it doesn't quite sound right. There's also not like a homogeneous space exactly between everything, and some of the overtones are just a little bit too lined up. So all of those things make it feel a little too correct and a little too perfect, and I think that a big part of getting the sadness right is to find the imperfection, not allow things to be perfect. If this was a dance record, it wouldn't bother me. But because it's not, because we're looking for something more mournful, we need a darker tone, we need a more realistic tone, we need something earthier. So the big culprit here was the violin. So I'm starting with some distortion and some wow. Wow is microtonal variation. This is going to create pitch inconsistencies, which is going to be really, really important to the sound of things. Once I bring this in, as subtle as it is, it immediately makes things blend. I'm actually doing the same thing over to the viola as well. So I'm going to bring these in and I'm going to play it again. And just this little variation is going to help it feel a little bit more real. Now, I don't know if you're picking up on that the same way I'm picking up on it, but to me, it's like the violin and the viola glue themselves into this background ensemble piece over here. which I think is a huge, huge step in the right direction. Now, we still have a lot of these like plasticky overtones. We got to get rid of that stuff. So some of the EQ that I'm doing here is an attempt to get rid of like the very highest end of these synth strings because they have that almost like Juno-ish high end, as well as clear up some low end for the bass. So that's more of a practical thing. Same thing with the cello here. You notice this very, very big cut to the mid-range. I found that there was something in the cello that was just a little too nosy and plasticky right around here, so I made a huge, huge EQ cut to that. And then, you know, everything else is kind of just like getting the volume levels right and things like that. I'm not going to spend too much time with this lo-fi texture, but, you know, there's no EQ even going on here. Actually, I don't know why I even had that up. I think I was starting to EQ it. Oh no, I changed the EQ over to the hoser. That's why I did it. But this is just making it blend a little bit, and then giving it a little bit of space with a tiny, tiny bit of delay. And lastly, some work on the bass to, again, make it blend. This is to make it be a little bit more expansive with the bass overtones, and this was just to tighten up the sub, but really nothing crazy going on here. So this is all just kind of tone stuff to make everything glue. So that's the basis of my string sound, but to me, it still sounds very synthy. So at that point, I said, okay, let's get another tape emulation here. Oh, there's an update available. Let's get another tape emulation going on here. Let's put the tape speed to 7.5, which is going to give me like the dirtiest tape sound out of the options. It's also going to roll off the top end the most, maybe control some of those plasticky overtones a little bit. And let's get a little bit of saturation going on with this. So that's my first move, and that made a pretty big difference. This tolerance button here, too, also creates little saturation variances, which I think is really important to the sound as well. It helps it to sound more realistically like tape, although it makes it take up more CPU. And then some back-end EQ where I'm taking out plasticky overtones, and then also just a little bit of low-mid build-up, right? And then lastly, bringing back some of the lost top end that's coming from doing this tape processing. So I'm going to run all of those down in series so that we can hear a quick before and after. I'm going to start from the middle of the strings and we'll hear that. Tape machine. You notice the softening of the plastic overtones. EQ. Now it's all starting to kind of mush together, but it sounds a little dull. Lastly, one more layer of EQ. Bringing back that sense of top end that it was missing before. So I'm going to bypass all of these things, then bring them all back in. And what you're going to hear is that while there is some tone shift, all of the different components of the sum of the strings get retained, but because there's this sort of murkier, saturated, kind of dusty feel to it, it makes everything glue together in a much more natural way. Now, I think the discerning ear is still going to understand that these are synth strings, but they don't feel nearly as synthetic as they did before. Let's do the before and after. And so this is sort of everything coming together. If I bypass these, the little pitch modulation distortions that I have on our loudest strings, and I take off all of the other tape effects. So this is basically a tape machine emulation going into a tape machine emulation. If I take all that stuff off and then I bring it on, really does soften a lot of that artificialness to it. And the other thing that it does is because it kind of leans the tone a little bit more into the low mids in a lot of ways, it also feels like it's kind of slowing things down without necessarily slowing things down, which I think is going to help to sort of pull the ear back in time and help things feel withheld, which is going to create a slight sense of tension that I think is going to add to this idea of the sadness being wistful. I don't know exactly how to put it into words, but somehow this feeling of it slowing down makes it feel a little bit sadder to me.